if the adult that abused you was a spiritual authority or a parental authority, that magnifies the abuse. And so that's where you would get, for example, into the category of a spiritual abuse, where that priest exploited that power, representing God's authority, love, goodness, and benevolence of that child in a way that they victimized and abused and harmed that child. And that only magnifies the impact. And one woman's testimony in the grand jury report, she said, "Every time I hear the word God, I think of him."
Buckle up, friends. You're listening to If I'm Really Honest, where I seek truth without tribalism. It's a place where ignorance isn't punished, curiosity is rewarded, and conflict doesn't mean contempt. As always, I hope I've brought you someone that you don't fully agree with, and you're here, so there's already at least one person you don't always agree with. Today, I'm joined by Randall Rauser, the Canadian author of over 21 books, including his most recent one, The Wideness of the Sea, How to Be Evangelical and Gay-Affirming. Yeah, we'll get into that. On an unrelated note, he's also an investigator of abuse allegations in faith-based organizations. Yeah, we'll get into that too. My distant cousins, I give you Randall Rauser. I definitely want to get into how to be evangelical and gay-affirming. That feels like, for me, emotionally, a continuation of Is the Atheist My Neighbor? It feels like the same spirit, although I obviously haven't read the new book. Which seems like a continuation of your spirit. So there's a lot there, but we should probably start with a definition of evangelical.
In the book, so I begin with this idea of what's a mere Christian, right? And a mere Christian, C.S. Lewis famously invoked the concept, right? It's easier to invoke the concept than actually to define it, particularly because Christian identity is what we call an essentially contested concept. So there's no universal unanimity among language users as to what actually is a Christian. There's always going to be some disputation about that. But I propose like a working definition of what is a mere Christian would be to go to a creedal statement, like a formal, relatively brief statement, which is produced by a recognized authority and has enduring authority or purchase or relevance for a large segment of people who use the term. And what meets that criterion for mere Christian, I would say, is like maybe the Apostles' Creed, but in particular the Nicene Creed. We don't know where the Apostles' Creed really came from. I mean, I don't want to get into that, but the Nicene Creed came from a clear authority, the Second Ecumenical Council, and it's a very good working definition of what it means to be a mere Christian. What does it mean to be a mere evangelical? I propose look for something similar. So sort of a brief, like quasi-creedal statement of evangelical conviction produced by a relevant authority and with, again, historical acknowledgement among a large section of language users for that term. And for evangelical, I say the National Association of Evangelicals Statement of Belief, produced in 1942, is a 7-point statement on what it means to be evangelical. And I think that's a very reasonable working definition. So I kind of launch from there and explore what it means to be evangelical and how gay-affirming is not inconsistent with the definition presented there.
Yeah. Okay. So then evangelicals are, in my experience, evangelical because they believe that is the right way to be Christian because it best represents the spirit of Christ. Is that fair or not really?
Well, it's fair. The problem, I think, is that what you've just said would apply to any professing Christian, right? Any professing Christian, whether a mainline liberal, Catholic, Orthodox, deconstructionist, they all believe that they are adequately or accurately and most faithfully presenting the spirit and teaching of Jesus. So even if you're like you're like a deconstructionist who believes God is a term for coming to have self-consciousness about the need to love one another, that'd be kind of like a very woolly deconstructionist postmodern conception. But if you believe that most faithfully really gets to the teaching of Jesus, then that definition you gave would apply to you too. And yet you'd, of course, be miles away theologically from an evangelical.
Right.
Yeah.
But
presumably, Jesus is alive if he's risen, and he has an opinion about how to be Christ-like. Jesus is probably Christ-like. So then the goal is to find out, well, what would Jesus' opinion be on this thing? Whereas I feel like a lot of the other terms, American, like a real American, a true American. Well, there's not there's not a person. We're not all trying to be like, what would George Washington do? And so we're more okay with the disagreements, whereas in the Christian realm, it's but if the Jesus' opinion on this thing is this thing, so it seems like it's inherently more antagonistic towards the other factions of it. Is that?
So what I'm hearing you say is sort of a plumb line for identifying correct doctrine or true doctrine, or what you might want to call orthodoxy, is to say, well, what would Jesus have believed about this? Because then we should just believe whatever Jesus believed. And first thing I would say
is, real quick, just to be clear, do you believe that Jesus is risen and alive today, and he currently has opinions that are Christ-like?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Cool.
I'm an Orthodox Christian. I believe in all the big things.
Yes. Okay. Cool.
Resurrection, incarnation, second coming, atonement, Trinity, etc.
Good. So I'm thinking present tense when I'm thinking about Jesus from the Christian perspective. Not what would Jesus have said about this, but what does Jesus currently say about this?
Okay.
Is that different?
Well, yeah. I mean, certainly it's an important distinction to make, because if we go back to the Jesus who was walking the earth 2,000 years ago, there's something called the kenosis. Paul refers to it in Philippians 2:5-11, how the Word, God the Son, emptied himself and took on flesh in the limitations of what it means to be human. And to some degree, that means this divine limitation that occurred through the incarnation means that God the Son had a human mind and developed over time and learned and grew. You actually have that explicitly stated in, let's say, Luke 2:40 and Luke 2:52, two verses that talk about Jesus as a boy growing in knowledge and wisdom and favor with God and other human beings.
Right.
So there's a development there. And the denial of that development of a human mind in Jesus was labeled by the early church as the Apollinarian error. So if you deny that Jesus had a fully human mind, then you would be stumbling into Apollinarianism. And frankly, I think many evangelicals today, with their incautiously high Christology, inadvertently stumble into a quasi-modern Apollinarianism. So,
real quick, can you define for the listeners high Christology?
So, well, when we talk about the Christology, you have two parts. You have the human and the divine in Jesus. And a high Christology is a Christology that elevates the divine potentially to the expense at the diminution of the human. And low Christology would reverse that order. And so it might elevate the human side of Jesus to the diminution or the loss of the divine. And a healthy Christology is going to maintain the balance between the divine and human within the incarnation. So,
thank you.
So then you have, even Jesus, let's say when he's teaching and a woman touched him and he said, "Who touched me?" You ask a very practical question. Was he pretending not to know, but he's omniscient, and so he really knew who touched him the whole time? He was just play acting? It's possible. But another option is to say he didn't know who touched him because he was a human being. And if he didn't know who touched him at that time, then that raises some interesting questions, right? What other things didn't he know? What things did he learn, as we already had in those verses in Luke 2? Or when he talked about the coming of the Son of Man, he says, nobody knows but the Father in heaven. So again, is he just being dishonest about the fact that as a human being, he didn't know? So when we talk about whether Jesus 2,000 years ago in the incarnation prior to the resurrection and exaltation, then there's always the question of what is the limitation in his human mind of knowledge? Because then you have to say it's always possible, A, that he lacked true beliefs. That's not just possible. I think that's trivially true. But I think it's like, for example, who's going to win the World Series in 2025, assuming that you believe there are facts about contingent events in the future, which is another philosophical debate, but assuming, that there are such truths to be known, Jesus didn't know that, I don't think, in the first century. He didn't know who's going to win the World Series in 2025.
More importantly
Jesus,
to me, like he probably didn't know about germ theory, which is probably why he didn't give us any advice on how to better care for some of our more practical needs. Is that fair? Things like that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I actually give a very simple example in my one book that you and I were just chatting about on how to be Christian or evangelical and gay-affirming, where Jesus famously says the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds. It's not. We certainly know that orchid seeds are like 1/20th the size of mustard seeds or even smaller. I don't think, first of all, that we should fault Jesus as a first century human being for not knowing which was the smallest seed. That's part of the kenosis. I would also say that was the fact that he referred to mustard seeds as the smallest of all seeds. I mean, you can always argue, well, he was contextualizing to the audience, accommodating to them, but he really knew all the time. I mean, you could say that, or you could just say he thought mustard seeds were the smallest of all seeds. That doesn't undermine the main point he's making about the growth of the kingdom of God. Anyway, we could talk a lot about all of those things, but just to say, when you talk then, the other side was God the Son now. And God the Son now, there's no longer a kenosis. The kenosis, the emptying has ended. And so his omniscience is full and complete. And so he knows all things. And so, yes, we should have all the true beliefs we should have all the beliefs Jesus does, because none of his beliefs are false, and we should want to have true beliefs. And I think that's certainly the case.
Back to the original question then.
Well, so you were talking about, you raised it as, in some way using Jesus as a plumb line, what he believed is what we should believe in terms of doctrine. And then you seem to say, and what you meant by that was Jesus in his omniscient state now. To which I would say, sure, of course, we should want to believe whatever an omniscient being believes, because they have all true beliefs and no false ones, and we should want to have true beliefs as well. I don't think, however, that gets you very far, because it's kind of a trivial thing when you think about it, to say that we should believe whatever an omniscient being believes.
So I'm not looking to debate any of this. Just trying to better understand the position here before we get into evangelicals and the gay community, and honestly the atheist community as well. Okay, so then Jesus doesn't say, and I'm going to pick a really easy one here that I don't mean inflammatorily. He never says don't have slaves, let's say. And for whatever reason, I don't really care. Now we think we should not just only be like that Jesus. We should be like omniscient Jesus. Omniscient Jesus says don't own slaves. So the goal is not necessarily to be exactly like that 2,000 years ago guy with his philosophies. The goal is to be as much like the omniscient version as possible.
My view, so first of all, let's have our cards on the table. Nobody comes to Jesus or anything else without presuppositions, without a starting point. And I come to the Gospels with that starting point that this is the incarnate Son of God. And as a result, I'm going to look to interpret the text consistent with those beliefs. Somebody who doesn't start with those beliefs is probably going to have different takes on things at key points particularly. So I believe it's Matthew 15, where Jesus interacts with the woman of Cana who asks for healing and for her child, and he says it's not right to give the food for the children to the dogs. Now, what he's doing there is he's calling that woman a dog, and he's calling Canaanites dogs. Now, today, as you know, I've got my dog in my lap. By the way, he's got a very long tongue, so it always hangs out. But we generally, in Western society today, we look upon dogs favorably. But in many societies, like in the ancient Near East, they looked upon dogs as dirty scavengers. So to call somebody a dog, even Donald Trump today will call people a dog, and he doesn't mean something positive by it. And similarly, in the ancient Near East, it was like the worst kind of slur to objectify or dehumanize somebody. So there you have Jesus dehumanizing this woman who's begging for healing for her child in the most callous way possible by calling her a dog. Well, then she comes back and she says, yes, but even the dogs get the crumbs that fall from the table. And So what do you do with that, right? Like, if I didn't have the starting assumption as to who I believe Jesus to be, I might just say, well, he was just having a bad day and being kind of xenophobic and racist and discriminatory in that moment. But there are keys in the text, hints of something else going on there. So, for example, when she responds like that, just think if a person is being racist or discriminatory to some person from an outgroup, and that person from the outgroup responds in a clever way back to them, what is the sort of racist person's first response going to be? It's not going to be, "Oh, that was awesome. You made me look bad with your really clever comeback," right? They're going to be pissed off. But Jesus' response to her is to praise her, not to be embarrassed. And that suggests to me that there's something else going on there. And so part of my framework then, again, informed by my reading assumptions as to who Jesus is that he was adopting the xenophobic, discriminatory prejudices against her that would have been shared by his audience, knowing how she would respond and giving her the opportunity to ennoble herself and her people with the very comeback she provided so that she became an agent in her own story. And I'm going to say I probably wouldn't have arrived at that interpretation if I didn't already have the starting assumption as to who I thought Jesus was. But I also don't apologize for interpreting the story through those lenses. It's going to be the same thing when I'm going to talk about Jesus and should he have said more about slavery? Well, actually, I think he said a ton about slavery. But keep in mind, how are you going to do things in the Greco-Roman world where Rome rules with an iron fist? Jesus didn't come simply to launch a political challenge to the powers that be, including directly challenging one of the key economic institutions of the empire, which was slavery. Had he done so, arguably that would have simply turned him into a geopolitical messiah rather than a universal messiah initiating a new kingdom. So instead what he does is he goes back to the source or the root that makes slavery possible, which is dehumanizing and objectifying people. And so we mentioned the woman of Cana. She's ennobled. The Samaritan woman, ennobled. The tax collector, ennobled. Each person, the woman caught in adultery, each one of them, you can go on down the line, he ennobles people that were outsiders, the leper, and he welcomes them in. The slave is another one of these. What he was doing was humanizing the very people that were dehumanized through the institution. And once you humanize them, it increasingly undermines the institution itself in a way that would effectively have flown under the radar of the Romans. So I do think, in fact, when we contextualize Jesus, we don't have to apologize for the way that he undermined slavery in the long term. We can rather understand the wisdom of what he was doing in its time and place.
That seems like the most honest and most effective way to get around those objections from atheists or from non-Christians, frankly. You need him to have meant more words than he had the freedom to say. Otherwise, it seems problematic to me. Does that seem fair, like a fair sentence to you?
You know, if a bolt is rusted on and you want to loosen that bolt, you have to be careful how much torque you're going to apply to loosen it, because at some point you might just end up snapping it off, right? So the whole question is, how do you apply the right amount of pressure over time and maybe get some grease and so on in order to loosen that bolt? If you had just gone in and directly said, slavery is evil, we need to stop this evil institution, rise up, Israelites, and let us fight the Roman evil devils, that would have just snapped off the bolt, right? And so that was, I think, a very effective way that he was doing it.
I think we both have the wrong color of skin to be saying such sentences, but I don't know that I disagree with you. To say, well, it was difficult to, say that slavery was bad. Obviously that's a what's the word? Characterization? I don't know the word. Caricature? There we go. That's the one.
It could be caricature.
Yeah.
But Roman slavery in the ancient Roman world wasn't a racially based. Keep that in mind.
No, I just mean in the comments, those people are going to see the color of our skin, and slavery is not something that we're allowed to discuss in a lot of of context. So without a whole lot of trolls. But again, I love this interpretation of Jesus as he's the one who's trying to find common ground and who is lifting up the downtrodden. Let's say that feels like the spirit I get from you in your debates and your lectures, and then is The Atheist My Neighbor? I love that one. I wish that every Christian could read that book. It would make for such better conversations across the board, and not just with atheists, but just with anyone who disagrees with you in general. Tell me about the new book that I haven't read yet, How to Be Evangelical and Gay-Affirming. How do you? What are some of the first steps? I know it's a whole book, but give me some pointers.
Well, so again, defining what evangelical is a key part of that, which, so I gave that definition from the North American, sorry, I keep saying North American because my background is North American Baptist. So when I say, when I see NA, I always think North American rather than National Association. So yes, the National Association of Evangelicals definition, that's a good definition. It doesn't say anything about being non-affirming or about the nature of marriage. So ultimately, and this is the interesting thing, how people who would ascribe to the National Association of Evangelical statement of belief would say it's inconsistent with being gay-affirming is by saying that the first of the 7 confessions of the statement require the evangelical to submit to essentially clear biblical teaching. And then the assumption is, well, the Bible is just clear on being non-affirming. So it's indirectly in contradiction to be gay-affirming and subscribe to that definition of evangelical. And so the last half of the book is about pointing out that it's not actually clear, that Christians do reasonably disagree. And I explain the 4 main areas through which doctrine is formed, because people often, evangelicals have a very reductionist understanding of how doctrine is formed, generally. The lay evangelical would anyway. And the way that is they kind of think you just count up Bible verses. And whatever the Bible says in a particular topic, that's what you should believe. And that's not actually how doctrine is formed. Doctrine is formed through the critical reading of Scripture, but always informed by a tradition, a reading tradition. And the question is, you have to be self-aware of that tradition. I just gave you an example of my reading tradition when I came to the story of the woman of Cana. I'm reading that from a way I was informed to read that text. If a person was raised in a secular humanist household, they were probably given a different set of parameters through which they would end up reading that text. Everybody has a tradition. And then there's also reason. Reason is a big category, which includes all sorts of arguments that people might appeal to in terms of philosophy, science, theology, in order to understand, justify, articulate, defend a particular doctrine. And then you have experience, your experience of God, your experience of other human beings, your lived experience of life. All of those things feed into how you ultimately end up thinking about doctrines. It's never just counting up Bible verses. And when you understand how diverse the range of reading traditions are, the range of arguments and experiences through which people read Scripture, you can understand why these issues are not actually as simple as evangelical critics of the gay-affirming community would like you to think.
So it seems like the Bible, though the ink on the page does not change, the interpretation of it, the understanding of what it means practically in our context, it can evolve over time. Would you agree with that sentence?
Well, so when we talk about the ink on the page, what is the ink of? Is it? So I agree with what you said, but I want to add another layer. So what is the ink even of? Well, it's a translation, almost certainly. People are reading the Bible through translations, and what they don't appreciate is that even the use of a translation is an interpretation, which itself is informed by all of these factors I just mentioned. Nobody is coming to the text without presupposition, without adornment. Everybody's reading through a set of lenses. And so when you come to a passage like First Corinthians 6, 8, and 9, where Paul says, in the NIV, the men who have sex with men will not inherit the kingdom of God. It's part of what he says. But there are like 24 other major translations of that passage, which includes two distinct Greek words, arsenokoitai and malakoi. And there's actually no... To say it's what it means as men who have sex with men is an interpretation, but it's very much a disputed one. And that's one of the things that people have to come to terms with. Again, it's just in terms of the clarity issue, recognizing that things are not always as clear as you may have once been told.
What do you bring to that text? Because in the earlier case, you said, the way that you approach the text determines to some degree the lens you see it through, or the way that you interpret it. What are you bringing to the text in that case that helps you get a more accurate translation of what he's trying to say there, or what the view is on the gay community in general?
My goal in the book, and for a particular passage like 1 Corinthians 6, 8, and 9, is not to tell the reader what to think about it. My goal is to point out that Christians, including evangelicals, reasonably disagree about what to think about it. And so some people end up thinking, because of the word arsenokoitai in particular, which it is believed Paul gets from the Levitical prohibitions of men having sex with men, that he's kind of just restating that blanket condemnation, and kind of get from that this is just that simple blanket condemnation view. But there are other people who point out various things, such as in Greco-Roman society, when you talked about men having sex with men, almost inevitably what you're talking about is a dominant male having sex with a younger male, probably a minor, maybe a slave, and often in a way that we would today consider exploitive, and even perhaps such that the other person, the malakos, did not have the ability freely to consent. In my day job these days, I was a seminary professor for 20 years, but now I'm for the last few years, I've been a workplace investigator. And one of the concepts that's very important when you're doing an investigation into things like sexual harassment and sexual abuse is consent. So what is consent? Consent, in order to consent, there's three primary factors. You have to be able to consent. The consent has to be active, and it has to be ongoing. And in jurisdictions across North America, that's what people look for when you want to talk. Was there sexual consent? If you have a person who's a malakos, the term, it comes from a term meaning soft, and it's kind of like a slur. So Paul is like using what you might call a derisive slur for the vulnerable male in the sexual encounter. And is that person even freely consenting? Is what Paul's talking about a healthy, monogamous, same-sex relationship, or is it something where an older male is taking a younger man, a slave, a minor child, and sexually exploiting them, and Paul's condemning that? And it's actually pretty complicated. And the point that I want to make in that section, for example, is, again, just to point out how evangelicals, who are all taking the text seriously, end up with different conclusions as to what to think about what is going on there. So once you recognize you can have reasonable disagreement, it undercuts the argument that being affirming is inconsistent with the National Association of Evangelical Statement of Belief. So it's not directly condemned in the statement, and it's not indirectly condemned in terms of violating clear biblical teaching, because in fact the issues are just not that clear.
So then, if we could talk about Paul for a second, my charitable view of Paul is Paul. He lived then. Like, what would you expect? He's talking to a group of people from his perspective, in their perspective. None of them have the perspective of 2025, and so of course, like there's going to be. They're going to say some problematic things. They're going to use some words that you don't like, but they are reaching towards this higher aspiration of being Christ-like in their context the best they can. so that, they're not going to say, oh, by the way, end slavery. Like it's not part of the conversation at the moment. So it's just like there are parts that you can just there are parts that are wrong, like for lack of a better term, like they don't necessarily translate to today perfectly. That's my view. There would be another view that that's not at all what Paul meant there. If you bring Paul into modern day America and say this is modern day American homosexuality, is this a problem? He's like, oh no, you thought I had a problem with that? That's perfectly fine. What kind of a Paul do you imagine is speaking there?
So I'm not sure, because what has often been, I've been talking about background assumptions that inform the way we read texts. One of those presuppositions that evangelicals tend to have is one that you would call human authorial inerrancy, which is typically just called inerrancy. But I want to specify what the claim is that any time the human author of Scripture opines on some particular issue, every time they make a truth claim, it is without error. And if you begin with that assumption, just like I began with the assumption when I read the Gospels that Jesus cannot be in error in his moral teaching. So I would definitely say that. But that doesn't, for me, extend necessarily to what every human author in Scripture says. And I can give you clear examples. To my mind, certainly I've given them in my book, Jesus Loves Canaanites. So, for example, in the Psalms, you have Psalm 137:9, where the psalmist says, "Blessed is he who takes their babies and dashes them against the rocks." I would be inclined to think that you're not blessed or to be favored or to be approved of if you take infants by the ankles, swing them into a rock and brain them. I think you ought not to do that, and you ought not praise others for doing that. So it would seem I'm disagreeing at that point with the psalmist. I believe the psalmist is in error in making that statement. If you are an inerrantist, however, or a human authorial inerrantist, and you believe the human author has in fact endorsed that, you have to really struggle to try to come up with some explanation for how sometimes it can be blessed to take babies and dash them against the rocks. So I'm freed up from that. And so when you come to Paul, I'm freed up from saying I have to necessarily approve of what I end up thinking he affirmed in the text. There could be bases. For example, I think God had providential reasons why he included Psalm 137:9, and I could certainly talk about that within the Psalms without baptizing what the human author said there. And I think likewise, Paul could have had errant opinions on different things, including things that made it into the Bible, without us feeling like we have to baptize those things. So would Paul, if we brought him in a time machine to today, end up being affirming or non-affirming? I'm not sure. And I'm also not convinced that would settle the question for what we should think.
Of course it wouldn't.
Yeah. So.
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm just agreeing. Yeah. A clarity does not affect our divisiveness at all, it would seem. So.
No, that's sometimes it clarifies it though, and lets us know where the points of disagreement really are. Because sometimes then you can avoid talking past one another and really get down to the issues you disagree on.
So does it surprise you that a book like How to Be Evangelical and Gay-Affirming is relevant in modern day America? Like it seems like there are a lot of people that need that book, and that's not a happy thought to me. Glad that it's there, but sad that it's relevant.
Well, one thing I talk about in the book is the relationship between gay marriage and interracial marriage. And I don't think evangelicals really appreciate, to be blunt, how much racism is in the historic evangelical tradition. There is a sidebar here, which is, so like the book's title is The Wideness of the Sea, and then the subtitle, How to Be Evangelical and Gay-Affirming. And you could ask the question, well, why would you want to be evangelical? I mean, that's a fair question to ask. I'm not really taking on that question here, but I will say that evangelical is a tarnished brand, and not just in the age of Donald Trump, in the age of MAGA evangelicalism. But in the 1960s, most evangelicals, and in fact, most Americans, were against interracial marriage. So when interracial marriage was legalized in 1967, there were a lot of people, including Bible-believing evangelicals, who were profoundly opposed to that. Today, we look back at that, and most of us are embarrassed at the fact that that opposition ever existed. I think arguably we're in a similar transition point now. Interestingly, in one survey that I talk about in the book, 40% of white evangelicals in the U.S. are themselves affirming in some way. So I think they are a very large minority of the evangelical population, and I'm trying to give them space to have their views heard.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, 40%. That's great. It's better than 30. So, yeah. And as far as like the historical positions, like there are so many of those. When I was a Christian, when I was learning my Christian history, like part of the beauty of modern Christianity, let's say in the last 100 years, is our flexibility, honestly, even though we're known for our rigidness, our flexibility to be like, oh, yeah, I think we got that wrong, and then switch to something that was that applied more practically in our current context. But I'm surprised how many Christians just don't know that history. Like, oh, that must have been all the bad Christians. Like, no, that was all the Christians. Like, it wasn't this little tiny group. Like, this is what the Bible clearly said. And if you went to church on Sunday, this is what you were told the Bible clearly says. So to be able to like put yourself in the reality of like as fully as you currently feel that gay lifestyle is an abomination to God, and the Bible says that's exactly how they felt about interracial marriage and a whole host of things. So yeah, I appreciate you pointing that out. I appreciate you pointing out a lot of things. I mean, you've done. I honestly, when I first ran across your material years ago, I didn't know that you were a Christian because you were pointing out a lot of the things that the opponents to Christianity were pointing out and validating some of the arguments that against Christians that were holding bad views. The one of my favorite work of yours is The Atheist, My Neighbor. Can you talk a little bit about what made you want to write that, or what your thought process was in that? Or
Sure. Yeah, that book that came out about 10 years ago now, and it is so in the book I point out that there is a long history of we all know this, but anti-atheist prejudice within the Christian tradition, and I give concrete examples of Christians who for centuries dehumanized atheists and treated atheism as sort of the embodiment of evil. And that continues today. It's softened somewhat, but you will still have Christians like William Lane Craig, one of the most influential apologists in the world, just constantly banging on this drum that if you are atheist, you should be a nihilist. And if you're not, you just haven't come to terms with the fact that your quote-unquote worldview is meaningless. And that is just, I mean, it's false, but also it is a fundamental dereliction of the call to love one's neighbor. Because to love one's neighbor is to treat one as you would want to be treated, and that means to steel man their arguments and their positions and recognize how much, in fact, we share with one another. And one of the problems is atheism is, so anti-atheist discrimination is supported by terrible proof texting. So you have passages like Psalm 14:1, the fool has said in his heart, or 14:3, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Well, what does that mean? So people, the way that they interpret that is to say, what that means is that atheists are fools. And so you actually see things like a bumper sticker that says April 1st is Atheist Day, which I can't think of a better way to repel the very people you profess to want to reach than by insulting them like that. Well, in fact, Psalm 14 is talking about not atheists, which there were no known atheists in the ancient Near Eastern society 3,000 years ago in which that was written. That's a total anachronistic reading of the passage. Rather, what it's talking about is people who profess to follow God and yet don't follow God consistently. They're saying in their hearts, oh, I will not be responsible for having failed to follow his law, even though they say with their mouth that they believe in him. And what that means is that Psalm 14 is condemning Christians who profess to follow him with their mouth and yet don't follow him with their lives. And the irony is they're using that very passage, which should be condemning them prophetically, to condemn atheists. The other one is Romans chapter 1, where Paul talks about knowledge, people refusing to accept the knowledge of God, the natural light that's been given to him, and so then they will be condemned. And one of the interesting things, well, one thing, first of all, is that Romans 1-3, the whole argument Paul is giving there is not about particular groups like atheists or gay people, because evangelicals have often exerted a few passages from the larger text to, use them as clobber passages for particular outgroups. Rather, Romans 1-3, the point is that all human beings are sinful, fallen, and in need of God's redemption. And if you end up interpreting passages from that are cherry-picked out of the larger narrative to attack different groups, you've completely missed the point that he was critiquing you. So that's the one thing. The other thing about Romans 1, which is interesting, the way that Christians have interpreted that against atheists is to say that people are without excuse because God's light has been given to them. But what that reading ends up doing is condemning any Christian who has ever had any doubt at all. Because if you are saying that God's existence and nature are manifestly clear through things that have been made to everyone all the time, then if any Christian ever has a moment of doubt, that is their own sinful rebellion, refusing to accept the evidence of God that's manifestly clear to them all the time. And yet, the vast majority of Christians are going to go through the dark nights of the soul. They're going to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. They're going to say, my God, why have you forsaken me? They're going to have questions and doubts. And they're not being sinful and suppressing the overt evidence for God's existence and nature in those moments. But if you can recognize then that Romans 1 doesn't condemn you in your doubt, why do you now use Romans 1 to condemn an atheist in their doubt?
Well, and it seems like there's always a timeline on that too. Like most Christians I've run into, they're okay with some doubt as long as it's the right level of doubt, it's on the right topics, and it's for the right amount of time. You exceed your limit on any of those, and then you've quickly become evil. There are many atheists I can think of. Jordan Hall would be at the top of my list of atheists who, at any point in their life, they're obviously not saved, and then they have a transition. How do you know that this isn't this person who's in this state that you believe is destined for not fellowship with God for eternity? Who's to say that they need a Christian friend, and if they are ever in a place where they might decide that they're going to become a Christian, they would need to have a Christian friend. Why don't you be that Christian friend to them? Just hang out and wait, because you don't know. But the condemnation of people who are taking too long and are on the wrong topics, it feels more defensive than helpful, like they claim to be. I don't know.
I just want to add another layer to what you've just said. Be there for people in their doubts so you can support them and help them through them. But also be with people in their doubts because you're going to be transformed and you're going to grow by being exposed to the doubts and questions of others. I gave an illustration in one of my books. So there's a bush plane flying in the Canadian North, and it crashes, and there's two people left in the bush plane in the northern woods lying in the snow. And the one person, they're waiting to be rescued. And the one person, as they're lying in the bitter cold on the snow, they say, oh, every part of my body aches. And the other person says, well, I can't feel anything at all. And they kind of drift off to sleep. Which of those two people is more in imminent danger? It's clearly the person with no pain at all. The person who has pain is getting feedback from their environment. They're still engaging. They're doing better, because pain is often a signal of us to look more closely at something. And the questions and doubts that people have are like those pains. They're healthy if you understand those within a collective community as being things that can spur on the entire community. I mean, imagine if you're in a community in a meeting and nobody's going to have any questions about anything, and then one person's like thinking, seems like I smell gas. Is that a gas leak? Oh no, I can't have any doubts. I better not say anything. And other people start doing the same thing, but nobody's going to say anything. And eventually someone lights a match and the whole building blows up because nobody was willing to express the doubts that they had. Well, doubts are like that, right? That they can often show us something is awry, something is a problem. And we do well when we have communities that both have people with deep devotion and conviction, but also people who have doubts and questions. They serve one another.
From the pastors that I've talked to, that analogy seems scarily relevant, because it seems like, well, I can't admit these doubts because I know that it is gas and this building will explode, and I don't want to be responsible for anyone leaving the faith if I admit that I've got questions, so I'd better not for the sake of everyone else. If you're going to admit your question, I guess you have to be willing for the building to explode if that is the end result. Like, you have to be open to the change that might happen, that you're afraid might happen, which seems like that might be why a lot of questions don't get asked.
There was a really interesting book that was written 30-some years ago called Skeletons, The Skeleton in God's Closet. I may have that off a little bit. It was kind of like the Da Vinci Code, but 10 years earlier, and also written by an actual historian of ancient Christianity. And it's kind of like a modern, I don't know what you call it, but it's a modern novel. And so there's like a guy who's an archaeologist, and he's on an archaeological dig, and they discover what appear to be the bones of Jesus in a dig in ancient Judea. So it looks like Jesus was not resurrected. And this guy, there's a moment in the book where he's reflecting on the fact that he graduated from Harvard University. And Harvard's motto famously is Veritas, truth. So, universities tend to have like a motto, and Harvard's has always just been truth. And so as he's reflecting, what does he do with the apparent evidence that Jesus didn't rise from the dead? He says, ultimately, I have to be concerned with truth. If he didn't rise from the dead, I want to know about it. I can't be satisfied with a falsehood. And so then he resolves to know. And that should be the commitment of every person, ultimately, is veritas, truth. That's what makes us uniquely human in some ways, is homo veritas, right? We are the individuals, hominids who seek truth.
I can't help but be distracted by the plot hole that finding Jesus' bones doesn't seem like it would very much prove that Jesus hadn't risen because he's got a new body. But
well, let's talk about that. Yes, he's
okay.
The tomb was found empty, right? The garments were folded up, and in Christian theology, the body that was laid in the tomb is the same body that is resurrected. It's resurrected to perfection. But Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 15 with the image of a seed being planted. And he talks about the spiritual body, the natural body. But there's a continuity there. The seed actually grows into the plant. It's not a complete replacement of it.
Yes. I didn't expect to get into this. There's continuity is an illusion, like even for you and me. I mean, I'm not made of the same cells I was not that long ago. So it at the cellular level, at least, Jesus probably left something behind, both on the cross and in the tomb, even if he was resurrected in that same body. So,
well, we turn over matter approximately every 7 years in our bodies, but there's still personal identity through time, despite the fact that our bodies change their material constantly. I mean, that's a different, like that's just a general problem of theories of personal identity and being a material being. But that's different than saying that the Christian view of the resurrection is that the resurrection body is just a completely different body, discontinuous from the body that lived for 30 plus years on earth.
Well, something is, I mean, there was some change there in his interaction with physics between post and pre resurrection. So something is different significantly, it seems. Like I just can't imagine when I was a Christian, if someone found the bones of Jesus, that would have really hindered my belief in the resurrection. But anyway, that's not...
That's another topic for another day, I suppose. The main point being truth, veritas.
Thank you. I got distracted. Yes, absolutely. Real quick before we go, I'm terribly curious about your position as a workplace investigator. As I understand, it's largely with churches. Is that right?
Well, my position title is with respect to church-based. We call them faith-based organization investigations, as opposed to faith-based investigations.
I'm sorry, say that sentence again. I didn't hear the difference.
So faith-based organization investigations. In other words, I investigate faith-based organizations. That's different from a faith-based investigation where you're basing your investigation on faith. Yeah.
Right.
So sometimes there's it's an infelicitous lack of clarity in the terminology. But yeah, that would probably be I would say about 30% of my work. Probably about 70% is general workplace investigations. But yeah, definitely I do them.
And you've been doing that for a few years now?
Yeah, full-time for 2.5 years or so, and part-time since 2019 or 18, somewhere around there.
Did you already have some experience in that field before, or was this a new line of work for you?
It started as one of my former students from 20 years ago. I became good friends with him over the years, and he's got an incredible background in this, and he started his firm in 2018. I started working with him part-time, got a professional investigator's license, and got what's called Association of Workplace Investigators credential holder. It's an intensive course of that. Done 130, 150 investigations, something like that. So that's my background at this point.
So then what did you learn through the training process and in your experience in the field that was surprising or that has changed your view of the world?
First of all, it's about interviewing people. It's a very human thing. You have to interview people and assess credibility. You talk about a he said, she said kind of thing. You're going to have a lot of that. So people give different accounts as to what happened, and you need to be able to assess credibility and to look at evidence dispassionately, aware of your own potential biases and accommodating for those in order to come to a defensible conclusion or finding on the balance of probabilities. That is the evidential threshold. It's more likely than not. And so you're going to investigate anything like harassment, sexual abuse, bullying, discrimination, things like that. Things that are in the workplace and that are governed typically by provincial or state-based legislation in terms of governing workplaces, as well as the internal policies, procedures, and codes of conduct of the organization. I would say this is that for churches, they still have a long ways to go in terms of taking the importance of a psychologically safe workplace and recognizing hazards in the workplace, including psychosocial hazards, recognizing those danger points, and being proactive in preventing the possibility of abuse occurring. Because abuse, it's not just the things that make the headlines like, some serial sexual predator. It's also things like the corrosive impact of contemptuous behavior, which can become harassing and can really create a toxic workplace over time, or the exploitation of people. This is one of the things, by the way, about a Christian or evangelical organizations that you sometimes see, is there's an appeal to, well, take up your cross and deny yourself for the sake of the ministry in a way that is actually breaching workplace legislation and, in fact, the very policies of the organization. So you end up abusing people for the sake of the kingdom, which should not be happening. So those are just some of the things that I've certainly seen and been wrestling with.
Yeah, I would imagine that being a Christian yourself, it gives you special insight into the dynamics of those kinds of workplaces, and it could be a major advantage. On the other hand, I imagine that if I was, a Jehovah's Witness and had experienced abuse and they brought in a Jehovah's Witness investigator, I'd be like, can I get somebody else? 'Cause I'd rather not have someone on their team. How does that dynamic play out for you in that in that workplace?
Well, so the kind of subtext I'm hearing there is when you say a Jehovah's Witness investigator, in other words, an investigator who has a reasonable, a reasonable apprehension of bias because they're already committed to this religious organization, and so they have a bias or a reasonable apprehension that they would be biased because they somehow are protecting the public institution, the face of the institution, something like that.
Yeah, and I don't mean that as an accusation. I just mean if I knew that investigator had ever been Jehovah's Witness, I'd feel like perhaps the cards were stacked against me.
Yeah, I mean, that would be just a misunderstanding, first of all. So the fact that a person is a Christian doesn't mean that somehow that prejudices them, biases them against complainants in investigation in a Christian institution. It just doesn't follow. And if somebody did raise that, like if a respondent, let's say, or a complainant objected to a Christian investigator, they could certainly appeal that to the organization, but I don't think that that's a reasonable concern. The idea, again, being that somehow, well, if you're a Christian, obviously you're going to worry about protecting the public face of the institution, and so you would have a bias to come out that the allegation was unfounded. I mean, it just doesn't follow. Yeah, another interesting thing, though, is that I've also done investigations where they involved, like there was one where it involved an atheist person who was complaining about experiencing discrimination and harassment from Christians. And they discovered that I was a Christian, and they had reservations about me investigating their complaint as the complainant because they thought, well, I'm concerned that you would be biased. So I had a conversation with them, and I allayed their concerns with that. And in fact, ultimately, the allegations were founded. The thing is, in the investigation, you have to lay out all your reasoning. So if you find somebody credible, or you find that the weight of evidence supports founded rather than unfounded, that all has to be explained within the report. And ultimately, the report is going to stand or fall on the arguments, the reasons given for the findings. And so a person, it's insufficient to say, well, I think they're biased because they're religious or they're non-religious. You have to ultimately have your arguments stand on their own.
Well, and I would imagine that you seem like you're in a especially great place to do that work because of your critique of the institution and your involvement with it. Like equally, if I was a church and I found that there was an investigator and they were an atheist and they were, anti-Christian, like I'd be like, can we get somebody else? Because obviously they're just going to try to take us down no matter what. To have someone who's deeply involved and understands it, but is also frequently critical as objectively as possible. That seems like that puts you in a perfect spot for that.
Just a couple final quick words on that. So sometimes people are going to have the misunderstanding. So when they're thinking an investigator, I think, for example, Smith believes they want to get some oppo on Jones, and so they hire an investigator to get the oppo on Jones. Maybe Smith and Jones are both running for political office. And so that's not what I do. That is very much an advocate for the person that has hired you. I am hired and I function as a neutral adjudicator, similar to a judge. So I don't have commitment to vindicate complainant, respondent, or the administrative point of contact that has hired me. My role is I'm hired to be an external investigator who's going to provide a position, a conclusion, a finding like a judge would. And so the very definition of that is to have distance from any potential bias.
So then one last question. The term spiritual abuse gets thrown around a lot. Is that a prosecutable thing? Does it ever come into any of these cases? Or is there fall under another category?
First of all, the term prosecution would be a term belonging to criminal law, not to administrative law, like I am doing here. So we don't talk, for example, about the accused. We talk about the respondent. We don't talk about victims. We talk about the complainant. So we want to keep that language neutral and clear. And again, remember the evidential standard is a balance of probabilities. Sorry, what was the actual question? I just
the term spiritual abuse.
Spiritual abuse. Yeah. Okay. So in terms of that term, first of all, it is definitely a factor. It's not a factor typically in terms of how it's not recognized in workplace legislation. So, for example, in the province of Alberta, Canada, where I primarily work, the provincial legislation is called the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the Occupational Health and Safety Code, and also Alberta Human Rights Act. In British Columbia, the neighboring province, it's WorkSafe BC. And then across provinces of Canada and across, I imagine, different states in the U.S., you're going to have different state-based legislation for the workplace as well. And there you'll have definitions for categories like harassment, bullying, discrimination, sexual harassment. You're not going to find spiritual abuse defined in there. That doesn't mean it's not a reality, however. You may have it potentially in a religious organization's policies. Although, again, whether or not you have it there, it is a reality. And I give the analogy to think about spiritual abuse. Similar thing is if you talk about, let's say, physical and psychological abuse, but you can also talk about familial abuse, like between or intimate partner violence, let's say. So intimate partner violence is a different kind of violence than just regular violence. Because in regular violence, it's one person hits another or whatever. But if it's an intimate partner, there's an added offense and harm that results from the fact that somebody you're intimately related to has been the abuser and aggressor. And that magnifies the impact. Similarly, when you have spiritual abuse, what a person is doing is they're manipulating the beliefs and the practices of an organization in a way that perpetuates harm on other people. And by doing that, for example, a pastor exploiting his role as, a representative of God and God's authority and power, that now magnifies the impact on the person. Where this really, a great example of this, great's probably not the word, but a powerful example of this was that the Pennsylvania grand jury report of 2019 into Catholic sexual abuse in the state of Pennsylvania. They interviewed hundreds of adults who had once been children and been abused by priests in the Catholic Church. It would be horrible for any child to endure sexual abuse of an adult. But if the adult that abused you was a spiritual authority or a parental authority, that magnifies the abuse. And so that's where you would get, for example, into the category of a spiritual abuse, where that priest exploited that power, representing God's authority, love, goodness, and benevolence of that child in a way that they victimized and abused and harmed that child. And that only magnifies the impact. And one woman's testimony in the grand jury report, she said, "Every time I hear the word God, I think of him." That's just for me in capsule summary of the incredible harm that can be perpetuated by spiritual abuse.
Yeah, and I think the church, the churches I've been involved in, don't understand the power that they wield in those situations. In most cases, they just feel like they're doing their church thing. They're just reading the Bible, just telling people what the Bible says, and they don't understand the impact that their representation of God has in the lives of the people. Well, I love what you're doing. I hope it spreads as far and wide as possible, because even though we disagree about some theological truths, I think the spirit is the same. We want good for our neighbors, and we want to be agents of love and spread that. So thank you for being there.
Amen. Jamin, it's been great. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you all for joining me. Now is the time where you zone out a little bit on what I'm saying and you go check out Randall Rauser's YouTube channel and also pick up one of his criminally inexpensive books on Amazon. This all very much connects to my upcoming video entitled A Complete Christian's Guide to Gay Marriage, so make sure you're subscribed so you're notified when that's released. And if you're an audio-only subscriber, you should know that the YouTube versions of these episodes contain loads of on-screen explanations, pictures, and diagrams. Plus, there are tons of bonus episodes that aren't included in the audio-only feed. Hopefully, it's obvious that I put considerable effort into each of these episodes so you can have them for free. So now it's your turn. Click a couple buttons and give me something for free, and we can keep this good thing going between us. And for all of you who super like this and want to be super fans, there's a link in the description for more free ways to show your support and keep this love train rolling. Be well, my distant cousins. I'm rooting for you, and you should too.